Okay, I'm going to get started. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim. August, what is today? Today's the 23rd. Second to last podcast from the month of August, it sounds like, if I know my days of the month. This is your host, David McDonnell. It's our weekly podcast, Random Thoughts from County Antrim, where I tell some stories, some yarns, some historical lessons or two, and of course, my random thoughts. Now, what are my random thoughts for the day? Well, I've been doing a lot of yard work in my house, labor, physical labor. And when you do physical labor, it's backbreaking, it's tiring. I have to take a nap in the middle of the day. Which, of course, reminded me of some stories of Irish laborers. Now, if you're an Irish American, or Irish anywhere, then you have a laborer in your family tree. That's what the Irish did. They did in America when they first arrived, and they did in Ireland. See, in Ireland, the English confiscated all the land of the Irish, and everything was owned by the by the English landlords. Now, for the rural Irish, and keep in mind that in those days when the Irish did their confiscations, virtually everybody in Ireland was a rural Irish. The whole country was rural. Still fairly rural today, but certainly much more then. And when the English confiscated the lands, the rural Irish had really but two choices. They either became a tenant farmer or they became a laborer in one form or another. Usually on the large agricultural operations that were operated by or for the English landlords. With the mass migration of the Irish across the Atlantic during the Great Hunger and the decades thereafter, well over 1 million Irish traversed the Atlantic. And they're amazing that the kind of information you can find, particularly if you're into genealogy, on the ship manifest that were maintained for these voyages. The names of the family member, their ages, place of origin. There's a wealth of information on these ship manifests. And the manifest typically included, in addition, the occupation of the emigrants. And they typically, keep in mind these are in a ledger form, 20-odd lines on the ledger form and a half a dozen columns with the name and family members and ages and place of origin, including the occupation. Now, I've given a lot of historical talks and stories at various places to mainly Irish American audiences, and I've asked this trivia question, and I almost always stump people with the answer. And that is, for the Irish aboard these ships coming across to America from the 1840s and the next couple of decades, what was the most common occupation listed on the ship manifest? Now think about that a minute. Was it farmer? It's a good guess if that's what you guessed, but that's not the answer. Not according to the ship manifest. Now, was that, what else could it be? Could it be laborer? That's a good guess as well. And it actually was a very common occupation for the Irish making the trip. And laborer is, in fact, the second most common occupation listed on these ship manifests. But the most common? Let you wait for it. The most common occupation of the Irish, as shown on the ship manifest, bound for America, was ditto. And I mean that seriously. If you've looked over ship manifest, as I have, you'll see occupation after occupation listed on the ship manifest. And it almost always was, the most common listing is ditto. And that's because, again, on these ledger sheets, you fill out the top line for the first person listed on the ledger sheet, When it comes to occupation, you list laborer. And then you go on to the second name on the list. You list the occupation. Ditto marks. Next name, ditto marks. Ditto marks. All the way down the page. And you'll see page after page after page where the first person listed was a laborer. Everybody else on the page for their occupation, it's listed as laborer. And that ditto is in fact the most common vocation of the Irish. Now when they got here, of course, they weren't in ditto. They were in fact laborers. And they're the people who clean the streets in the big cities. They emptied the ships in the harbor cities. When they moved west, they worked in the mines and they built the railroads and performed whatever form of labor could be performed. And that's not a stereotype of the Irish of the 19th century in America, but rather it's a fact of life. It's what the Irish did for a generation or two until they began to see some avenues to move on in the world. Now, I have a wealth of stories about Irish laborers in America, Irish laborers in Ireland, and I'm going to tell you one of those stories shortly. But first, I wanted to make a confession. And the confession is this. I believe in witches. Now, it's not so much a belief in that I believe there are witches. I just know it's true. It's a fact. Much like gravity. Things fall, gravity. And there are witches in the world. Now, I have a doctorate degree. It's not in witchcraft. It's in another field of study. But getting a graduate degree meant I had to hang around at universities for quite some time. And it meant that I was a little bit reticent to admit that I believed in witches. The people in the university community look to things like data and evidence. And they tend to shun people who have a belief in something that is difficult to show evidence in support of or data in support of. So I tended to be kind of quiet about my belief in witches. But I'm coming out of the closet now, so to speak. And the reason is there are many, many examples out there in the world today where people are coming out with beliefs that are shunned by those who are more educated or have more study in the field. But these things are becoming more and more socially and even intellectually acceptable. And people now believe in things that most educated people don't. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One example is the flat earth people. Many people, in fact, around the world believe that the world is flat. Now, why? Well, you can see it. You look out your window or you go outside and you look, and what do you see? You see a flat earth. It's obvious to those people. Now, anyone who says otherwise is part of a conspiracy. That includes NASA and airlines who somehow seem to claim to fly around the world, scientists and others who measure the curvature of the Earth. All those people must be involved in a conspiracy because it is clear for all when you look out. In fact, I'm looking out my window right now, and it's flat. And I don't know, maybe those flat earth people are right, but they're not unabashed in coming out and telling everyone that the world is indeed flat. Now I'll tell you another group of people. I wanted to say this about the flat earth people. I saw a thing not too long ago on the internet where someone made the comment, and it just was spot on to me. And that is with the coronavirus. All of us, or most of us anyway, are social distancing. We're spread apart. We're looking to be 6 feet from anyone else, and that person 6 feet from someone else, and someone else. As you get the world's population spreading out and spreading out further and further away from each other. The question is, has anyone fallen off the edge of the earth? I don't know the answer to that. It just seems like maybe someone might, in light of social distancing. But now let me give you another example of what some people would think is a far off kind of idea. And that is the QAnon people. They believe that there is this worldwide group that controls everything. They control governments. They control the media. They control Hollywood. They control universities. Not just in America, but all over the world. And these people are Satan-worshipping pedophiles. And some of them hang out at pizza parlors in Washington, D.C. Now, the QAnon people are coming out of the woodwork. And their beliefs, which were once thought as a bit loony, are becoming mainstream. Now, maybe they're onto something. I don't know. And in fact, it's very difficult to argue with the source of their information. The source is the Anon in the name, tells you part of the source. It's from an anonymous internet forum. And there's some guy on that forum, on one of the forums, who goes by the name Q. And Q posts things anonymously on the forum. And Q's postings are the source of the information for the QAnon people. Now, how could you not trust postings from someone by the name of Q who posts things on an internet forum? It's maybe they're onto something. Anyway, if people can believe that the flat earth is controlled by Satan-worshipping pedophiles, who may, in fact, someday fall off the edge of the earth, then I can believe in witches, and I should not be held in disdain for that belief. So I thought I'd tell you a story, because that's what I do. I have these random thoughts, and it leads me to a story. Now, there were two laborers in County Wicklow in Ireland, and they shared a small hut as their living quarters. And inside the hut, when it was time, after they worked hard all day, when it was time to go to sleep, I shouldn't say bed, when it was time to go to sleep, they kind of pushed the hay in one end, two spots in the hut. One kind of against the wall, one a little closer to the door, and they laid out a little pad on top of the hay. So one laborer slept against the wall, another one closer to the door. Now, they were hard-working men, day after day after day, but the man who slept closer to the wall noticed that the other man seemed to be extremely tired during the day. He wasn't really doing his share of the work, to be honest with him, so it perturbed him a little bit. But he was also concerned because he just seemed listless and tired. He didn't seem like his normal self. So he finally asked him one day, "What's the matter? You're not acting your ordinary self. You seem sleepy and listless during the day." "I'll tell you what was the matter," was the reply. "A witch comes into our hut when we are sleeping, and she puts a bridle on my head and mumbles a few words, and then turns me into a horse. And then she puts a saddle on my back and shoe horses on my arms and legs, and then she rides me for the rest of the night. Now, this has happened 3 nights in a row." "Bullock," says the first man, he says, "there's no witch that can turn you into a horse. You must be having a bad dream." He says, "Bullocks, you say? The only reason why the witch picks on me and not on you is that I sleep closer to the door. If we switch places and I slept along the wall and you slept by the door, it's you that would be having what you call a bad dream, and it would be me who was sleeping through the night." "No," said the first man, it's not true, and I'll prove it to you. We will switch. I'll sleep by the door tonight. You sleep against the wall. And we'll see what happens when this witch comes by. So that night the two men did indeed switch. The laborer who used to sleep by the wall now slept by the door. And the laborer who used to sleep by the door now slept by the wall. Now around midnight, while sound asleep, the laborer who was now sleeping by the door felt something being placed on his head. And he woke up to see a woman standing over him, and she was putting a bridle on his head. Now he looked at the woman and he recognized her. She was the wife of a farmer who lived down the road. Then he heard the woman mumble some words, which he could barely make out, but it sounded something like, "Tu la luma, tu la luma." And when the woman finished her mumble, the man turned into a horse. Now once he was in a horse, she put a saddle on his back, and she put horseshoes on his 4 limbs. She led him outside, and then she got on his back and rode him around all over the countryside as fast as you could go. And they finally, after hours of this, and the man, now a horse, became exhausted from so much running with this woman on his back. Eventually they came upon a house, and in the house there was a party going on. The woman tied the horse outside, and then she went inside. And there was some dancing going around and parties and quite a session. It was a real rah-rah. And the horse at first rested, but then began to jiggle, move around, shake his head, doing whatever he could. And eventually, as he moved back and forth, the bridle came loose. And as it loosened, he shook it off. And then he immediately remembered the words that she used. And she was what was it? He was trying to remember. And it was tu la luma, something like that. And he recited it over and over. And eventually, he turned it back into a man. Now, once a man, he took the horseshoes off his hands and his feet, took the saddle off his back, and he ran as fast as he could. Ran for miles, trying to get away from this witch. Then he stopped, and he started to think. He says, I'm free now, but she knows where I live. And she'll be back tonight, tomorrow night, the night after. I'll be turning into a horse every single night. So then he got an idea, and he returned back to the house where the party was going on. And eventually the party ended, and the woman, who was a witch, came out. He waited very, very patiently for her to come out. And when she came out, the man snuck behind her and put the bridle over her head. And then he muttered, "Tu la luma, tu la luma." And within moments, she turned into a horse. So he put the saddle on her back, and he put the horseshoes on her limbs, climbed on her, and rode her all the way back to his hut. Tied her up by the door, climbed inside the hut, and went to sleep. Now the next morning, he took her, she was still a horse, tied up to his house. She never took the bridle off or the saddle off. Got on her and he rode her to the farm where she originated, because he recognized her as the wife of a farmer down the road. So he rode the horse to the farmer down the road. And when he got there, the farmer was already outside doing his chores. And when he got there, he said to the farmer, he says, "I have this brilliant-looking horse, as you can see right here. She's the finest horse I've ever owned. But I have a need for a strong workhorse. I really don't need this kind of fine-looking animal. He said, "Are you interested in a trade for such a horse?" The farmer looked at the horse from front to back, and he started inspecting the horse. And it wasn't a square inch of that horse that he didn't take a look at. And he said, the farmer said to the laborer, he says, "This looks like a very fine horse. Although I must say there's something about this horse that looks familiar. But I do have an extra workhorse. And I think my wife may take a liking to your horse. So we'll make the trade." And boom, 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 just like that, the trade was made. The laborer led his new workhorse back to his hut. Now the farmer took his new fine-looking horse into the barn. And there he removed the bridle. Started humming a tune, which may have sounded a little bit like the chant. And after he hung the bridle on the peg, he turned back around to the horse, and the horse was gone. What he saw was completely different. What he saw was his wife, with a saddle on her back and horseshoes on her hands and her feet. And so, the farmer gave up a good workhorse, thinking he had a new horse for his wife. Instead, he only had his wife. Now that's the story of the laborer and the Wicklow witch, which I thought of today as I was doing my chores as a laborer in my own County Antrim. So that's the end of the podcast. Please forgive me for believing in witches. And I'll forgive you if you believe in the flat earth and the QAnon theory, although I won't forgive anybody for being a Satan-worshipping pedophile. But take a look at my website, clandonald.net. Send me an email if you're of a mind to at clandonald@gmail.com. Like and share me on Facebook. Take a look at my books, Clandonald and By the Horse of Guinness. And until next week, goodbye and shalom.